This episode of Mr. Hutchings History is now streaming on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and all your favorite platforms like Castbox, Podcast Addict, and Amazon Music. Tune in now.
Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Welcome back, everyone. We're diving into a really interesting chapter of American history today. How the U.S. went from absolutely not getting involved to being a major force in World War II.
Yeah, it's fascinating, really. How did that happen? What were the turning points?
Right, like we're talking about a total shift in America's role on the world stage.
Exactly. And we've got some great sources to help us understand this transformation. We'll be looking at excerpts from a history podcast and this text called The End of Isolationism, America's Path to World War II.
So our mission, should we choose to accept it, is to figure out how the U.S. went from isolationism to becoming a key player in the Allied victory.
And what were the key factors at play? You know, public opinion, the decisions of powerful leaders, and the impact of global events.
It's like, how did the nation go from, this is not our fight, to we have to be all in?
Right, and there's so much to unpack. I mean, we've got disillusionment after World War I, the fiery arguments of figures like Charles Lindbergh, the impact of the Blitz, and then, of course, the pivotal moment of Pearl Harbor.
Okay, so let's rewind the clock back to the aftermath of World War I. What was the mood in America like then?
Well, think about it. World War I was supposed to be the war to end all wars, right?
Yeah, the war to make the world safe for democracy.
Exactly. And then it turns out to be this incredibly bloody and costly conflict. America emerges from that war deeply disillusioned. There's this sense that, well, maybe it was all a mistake.
Like, all that sacrifice. For what?
And then you have the Nye Committee Hearings in the 1930s. These hearings really dig into why America got involved in World War I in the first place.
And what did they find?
Well, what they uncover leaves a lot of people feeling like the U.S. was essentially tripped into war by business interests, you know, those who profited from the fighting. That feeling, that sense of being used, really sticks with a lot of Americans.
I can see how that would make people hesitant to get involved in another overseas conflict. Like, fool me once, shame on you.
Right. And on top of that, the Great Depression hits in the 1930s. Suddenly, everyone's focus shifts inward. It's about domestic recovery, jobs, putting food on the table.
Yeah, survival mode kicks in.
Exactly. Getting tangled up in foreign conflicts is pretty much the last thing on anyone's mind.
So that's where the Neutrality Acts come in.
Yeah. The Neutrality Acts of the 1930s were a concrete expression of that isolationist sentiment that was sweeping the country. These acts essentially shut the door on U.S. involvement in overseas wars. No arms sales, no loans to warring nations. It was a clear message. America was staying out of it.
America first, right.
That was the prevailing mood. But then you have President Roosevelt, who's seeing the danger of fascism brewing in Europe, and he's not on board with this whole isolationism thing at all.
He's got a different perspective, a global one.
Right. Roosevelt recognizes from early on that what's happening in Europe is not just some far-off European squabble. He sees it as a fight for democracy, a global fight.
And there's that great quote from his 1939 Fireside Chat where he says, "Even a neutral cannot be asked to close his mind or his conscience."
Powerful words, right?
Yeah.
Saying that even if America isn't actively fighting, it can't just ignore what's happening morally. It has to take a stand.
So Roosevelt is trying to walk this tightrope, balancing public opinion, which is largely isolationist, with his own belief that the U.S. needs to play a more active role.
Exactly. He understands he can't just force the country into war, but at the same time, he's strategically preparing the U.S., you know, behind the scenes.
So it's like he's playing this long game.
He is. And one of his early moves is the cash and carry provision.
Cash and carry, what was that?
Basically, it allowed countries at war to buy arms from the U.S., but they had to pay cash and transport the goods on their own ship.
So technically the U.S. is staying neutral, but
it was clear that this arrangement was mainly benefiting the Allies.
clever workaround to those Neutrality Acts.
Right. And then, by 1941, things are looking really bad for Britain. That's when Roosevelt comes up with the Lend-Lease Act.
Okay, so Lend-Lease, tell me more about that.
This was huge. With Lend-Lease, there was no more pretending to be neutral. The U.S. was now openly providing weapons and supplies to any country deemed vital to its own security, which basically meant helping the Allies.
So America's getting more and more involved. But I imagine public opinion was still pretty divided at this point.
It was. But then something happened that really shifted public sentiment. The Blitz.
The bombing of London by the Germans.
Exactly. Seeing those images of London, you know, just being bombed night after night on the news, and hearing Churchill's speeches so defiant, it really started to change things here.
Yeah, it's one thing to hear about a war, but seeing it happening, it hits differently.
For sure. And the bravery of the British people during the Blitz really galvanized support for them here in the U.S. I mean, the war suddenly felt much closer to home for a lot of Americans.
Right, like it was no longer just some distant conflict across the ocean.
Exactly. And Roosevelt, he saw an opportunity. He negotiated the Destroyers for Bases agreement with Britain.
What was that? I haven't heard of that one.
Basically, it gave Britain 50 older U.S. destroyers in exchange for access to British bases in the Atlantic.
So still technically neutral, but definitely helping the Allies.
Right. Another step closer to involvement, but still promising to keep American troops out of the fighting. But then, well, December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor. It changes everything.
Yeah, I mean, Pearl Harbor is the turning point in all this, right?
It is. It shattered that illusion of American isolation. The attack unified the nation in a way nothing else could have. It brought a definitive end to the isolationist debate.
I mean, war was declared the next day.
It was even the America First Committee they disbanded,
Wow.
recognizing that the world had just fundamentally changed.
And then there's Roosevelt's speech, a date which will live in infamy.
Such a powerful speech. The U.S. was officially in World War II.
It's amazing how one event can change everything.
It really is. And, it's interesting to consider the different ways historians have interpreted this whole period.
Oh, how so?
Well, you have the consensus school historians like David M. Kennedy. They see Lend-Lease as the pivotal moment. The writing was on the wall even before Pearl Harbor.
So in their view, Pearl Harbor was more of a catalyst for something that was already in motion.
Exactly. But then you have the realist school historians like George Kennan. They argue that it was Pearl Harbor itself that forced America's hand.
Because up until that point, isolationism was still a viable option.
Right. They say the attack made it undeniably clear that isolationism just wasn't possible anymore. America's security was now directly threatened.
So two different interpretations, but both with valid points.
Exactly. And that's what makes history so fascinating, right? It's not just a set of facts. It's about trying to understand the forces at play, different viewpoints, the complexities.
It's a puzzle with more than one solution.
Right, and that complexity is what keeps us coming back to it. Now, we've talked about how America moves from isolationism to interventionism, but what about the actual impact of that shift? How did America's entry into the war shape the course of the war itself?
Yeah, good question. What difference did it actually make?
Well, first of all, American industrial might was a game changer.
Right, we were this economic powerhouse, pumping out supply.
Exactly, and unlike Europe, our industries were largely untouched by the devastation of the war. So we could produce tanks, planes, ships on a scale that the Axis powers just couldn't match.
We became the arsenal of democracy.
That's the phrase, providing a flood of resources that were crucial to the Allied war effort, especially in those early years when things weren't looking so good.
So we provided material support,
Yeah.
but then there were American troops fighting as well, right?
Absolutely. American soldiers, sailors, and airmen fought bravely on multiple fronts in Europe and the Pacific. Their sacrifices were immense.
And those sacrifices ultimately helped secure the Allied victory.
They did, but it's also important to remember that America's involvement wasn't without its complexities. There were strategic missteps, difficult moral dilemmas, and long-lasting consequences.
You're talking about things like the decision to use atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
That's one example, yeah. The ethical implications of that decision continue to be debated even today. And then there's the whole issue of America's relationship with the Soviet Union during the war. They were allies against a common enemy, but
But there were cracks in that alliance already.
there were seeds of mistrust and ideological conflict that would eventually blossom into the Cold War.
So did the victory in World War II kind of pave the way for the next global conflict?
In a way, yes, but World War II also had a huge impact on the United States itself. It cemented our position as a global superpower.
Right, the leader of the free world.
And it completely changed our relationship with the rest of the globe.
Like America had its coming-of-age moment on the world stage.
That's a good way to put it, and there's no question that the experience transformed the country. But did America truly learn from this experience? Did it find that right balance between isolation and intervention in the years that followed? Tough questions.
Those are big questions. And it makes you wonder what lessons from this period, this shift from isolationism to global engagement, are still relevant for us today.
Absolutely. The echoes of this period can be felt in many of the challenges we face as a nation and as a global community.
It's amazing how much we can learn from looking back at history. It helps us understand not just where we've been, but also where we might be headed. It really is fascinating. And thinking about all this, I'm curious, what about the impact back home in America? Did World War II change American society itself?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, one of the biggest changes is the role of women. With so many men off fighting, women stepped up in incredible ways. They took on jobs in factories, shipyards, all kinds of industries that had been dominated by men before the war.
Yeah, I mean, Rosie the Riveter, right?
Exactly. Rosie the Riveter became this iconic symbol of female strength and resilience during the war. And this experience, it wasn't just a temporary thing. It really challenged traditional gender roles and helped pave the way for the women's rights movement later in the century.
So it had a lasting impact.
It did. Women proved that they could handle jobs that had previously been considered men's work, and they weren't willing to just go back to the way things were before.
That makes sense. War can be a catalyst for social change sometimes, even if it's not the primary goal.
Yeah, for sure. And speaking of social change, we also have to talk about the experience of African Americans during this period.
Right. It's a crucial part of the story.
For African Americans, the war years were a time of both progress and continued struggle for civil rights. On the one hand, you have Black Americans serving with distinction in the armed forces fighting for their country,
Right.
but at the same time, they often faced discrimination and segregation within the military itself.
So fighting for democracy abroad, but still facing inequality at home.
Exactly. It's a reminder that the fight for freedom and equality takes place on many different fronts, and that it's often a long and difficult journey.
And that struggle continued after the war as well.
Yeah, it did. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s was deeply influenced by the experiences of Black veterans who came home from the war determined to fight for the same freedoms they'd fought for overseas. They had seen what was possible and they were ready to demand change.
So World War II was about so much more than just winning battles. It was about pushing America closer to its ideals of equality and justice for all its citizens.
It was. And looking at the global stage, the war also led to the creation of the United Nations, this unprecedented effort to create a lasting peace and prevent future wars.
Which was Cordell Hull's vision, right?
Exactly. He really believed in international cooperation. And while the Cold War obviously presented a huge challenge to that vision, the UN has still played a significant role in the world, mediating conflicts, providing humanitarian aid, promoting global development.
It's not perfect, but it's something.
Right. It's an imperfect institution, but it has undoubtedly made a difference.
So much happened in such a short period of time. I mean, it's incredible how much impact this one era had on the course of history, both for the U.S. and for the world.
It is. We've gone from isolationism to interventionism, witnessed the rise of America as a global superpower, and explored these huge social changes that were happening here on the home front. And we've seen how the seeds of the Cold War were sown even as the Allies were celebrating victory in World War II.
Wow. So much to think about.
Definitely. I mean, as we wrap up this deep dive, I think the biggest takeaway is that history is never simple.
Right.
It's a tapestry woven from all these different threads, individual choices, political ideologies, economic forces, chance events, and it's a story that's still unfolding. America's role in the world continues to evolve, shaped by the lessons learned and sometimes ignored from the past.
And to our listeners, as you continue to explore this era, ask yourselves, what are the enduring legacies of World War II? How do those legacies shape our world today? And what lessons can we draw from America's journey from isolationism to global engagement?
Great questions to consider. And remember, history is not just about the past. It's about understanding the present and shaping the future.
Well said. This has been such a fascinating deep dive. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.